Once upon a time, in a snowy little town nestled between the mountains, there lived a young girl named Clara. Winter had arrived in full force, and Clara spent most of her days indoors, wrapped in thick blankets, dreaming of adventures. One frosty morning, as the sunlight streamed through the frosted windows of her grandmother's old house, Clara decided to explore the attic. It was a place she'd always been curious about, a treasure chest of forgotten family relics. She climbed the creaky ladder, her breath fogging in the icy air, and pulled open the heavy wooden door. Inside the attic was filled with dust, dancing in beams of golden light. Boxes and trunks were stacked haphazardly, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Clara rummaged through the piles, unearthing old photographs, yellowed books, and delicate porcelain dolls. Then tucked in the corner, she found it. A patchwork quilt folded neatly atop a cedar chest. The quilt was unlike anything Clara had ever seen. It was made of countless squares of fabric, each one a different color and texture. Some were silky, others rough, and a few had tiny embroidered patterns. It looked ancient, yet well loved, with a faint, comforting smell of lavender. Intrigued, Clara unfolded it and spread it out on the attic floor. As she ran her fingers over the fabric, she noticed something peculiar. Each patch seemed to hum faintly, like a melody just out of reach. "Odd," she murmured, lying down and pulling the quilt over her. The moment she closed her eyes, a warm sensation enveloped her, and the attic began to fade. When Clara opened her eyes, she was no longer in the attic. She stood in a bustling market filled with vibrant colors, the air alive with the chatter of merchants and the scent of freshly baked bread. A woman in a flowing dress turned to her and smiled. "You're Clara, aren't you?" Clara blinked. "How do you know my name?" The woman gestured to a nearby stall, where a square of fabric identical to one on the quilt hung on display. This market was one of your great-grandmother's favorite places. She bought that piece of cloth here. Before Clara could respond, the scene began to shimmer and fade. She found herself in a new place, a quiet meadow under a twilight sky. A man sat on a blanket, playing a soft tune on a fiddle. He looked up and waved. "This," the man said, "is where your grandfather proposed to your grandmother. That quilt you have? It's their story." Clara gasped, looking down at the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. It wasn't just a patchwork of random fabrics. It was a collection of memories, each square representing a moment in her family's life. The quilt carried Clara to more places. A small kitchen where her mother, as a child, helped bake her first loaf of bread. A moonlight lake where her uncle and aunt shared their first dance. A sunflower field where her father used to play as a boy. Each memory was vivid and full of life, and Clara felt as though she were truly there, experiencing the emotions and joys of her ancestors. When Clara finally returned to the attic, the quilt still wrapped around her, she sat for a long moment, staring at the fabric, she realized something profound. Her family's past wasn't just a collection of dates and photographs. It was a tapestry of experiences, joys, and dreams. And now, she was part of that tapestry, ready to add her own patches. That evening, she carried the quilt downstairs and draped it over the back of the sofa. Her grandmother, noticing the familiar fabric, smiled. "That old thing," she said, her eyes twinkling. "It's got quite the history, doesn't it?" Clara nodded, a knowing smile on her face. "It sure does." Sometimes, the past holds treasures that remind us of who we are and inspire who we can become. The end.